This is Optometrists Building Empires, and I'm your host, Ankit Patel. Each week, we'll explore the journey of multi-practice ownership and leadership in optometry. Join us for insights and strategies from the top minds in our field. This show is sponsored by My Business Care Team. My Business Care Team helps your office increase revenues, reduce costs, and reduce staffing headaches. Let's build your empire together. Today's guest is someone who I actually knew from other activities in the industry. So I'm excited to have him on the show. He's a distinguished optometrist, an entrepreneur, and speaker. His dedication to excellence in optometry really earned him some really prestigious accolades. He was Newsweek's top 150 optometrist list in 2021, 2022, and 2023. He co-founded ODs on Finance. It's a personal finance platform with over 30,000 members. And he co-authored the book, The Optometrist's Guide to Financial Freedom, which is an Amazon bestseller. He's the owner optometrist at Los Altos Optometric Group and Pacific Eye Care, as well as co-founder and COO of ODs on Finance. Please welcome Dr. Aaron Neufeld. Aaron, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, so I'm really excited to have this conversation. You guys are, I've been following you guys in ODs on Finance, so I'm curious to hear your thoughts on some of the things that we're going to talk about. So let's jump in. First question I'd like to ask everyone is, what is the most important thing that helped you grow your empire?
Yeah, Anki, I think it comes from detachment. It comes from detaching yourself from the business, from being that owner operator and kind of looking from an outsider perspective. Because ultimately you can work in your practice. You can be a doctor 5 days, 6 days, 7 days a week. But if you're not running the business, if you're just being that technician, then you're not going to be able to grow that business. You're not going to be able to scale properly. So really detachment and just understanding that, hey, I can delegate tasks to different folks. We now have many associate doctors. We have staff that handle a lot of things that I used to do. And understanding and just trusting those individuals, that's what really helped us grow.
Yeah. So tell me a little bit about that, because I think a lot of people talk about that, right? They talk about letting go, working on the business, not in the business. Where did you get stuck? How did you overcome that? Why did you find that? How were you able to do that?
Yeah. Well, I think the number one thing is just actually doing it. I think there's just a big divide between wanting to do it and actually doing it and just kind of jumping over that hurdle. Because I think a lot of it comes down to trust. This is your baby. Every business, whether it be a practice or any other sort of business, is your baby, and you're wanting to grow that. And so you're not wanting to release control and responsibility to other individuals, but finding those individuals and allowing them to take tasks that may be a little bit more decision-making for your business is really pertinent, because ultimately you can't be doing everything at once. So I think that's number one, is just getting over that hurdle. The second thing is creating operations so that it all works out okay. Because you can have a lot of people take over big responsibilities. They don't know what they're doing. It's not going to turn out good. And the way that we do it in our practices and, other businesses that I run is ultimately we're not given, this unique blueprint where it's step-by-step instructions. Obviously we do have operations. We kind of allow a little bit of creativity, but at the same time it's structured, because one thing that we've found, and I think it's true across any business, is if ambiguity prevails, then folks are not happy, and ultimately they don't know what they're doing. They don't have passion, and that leads to attrition. So once again, just kind of operations that allow for directionality, but also allow for creativity.
Interesting. I've seen things like that, like with checklist versus like a step-by-step process. Like just make sure these things are done. How do you all do that? Because it seems like you said, ambiguity is sort of the enemy of it, right? And so that seems like it might introduce some ambiguity, so creative freedom.
Yeah. The big thing, we actually use checklists a lot. And what we'll do is we'll normally do scheduled checklists. It's kind of like something that, hey, you feel good after doing the scheduled checklists. Every week, every staff member has responsibilities. They take ownership of those responsibilities. So if I assign a staff member something, it's like, hey, you're doing this and no one else is going to be doing this. But the welfare of our patients is going to be in your hands. Welfare of this business and also your fellow employees is going to be in your hands as well. So creating that accountability and also just having that, means to success by, hey, we're going to check this off every week. Make sure you do it. During our meetings, we're going to talk about this. We're going to recognize you for doing these tasks and for growing the business. those are big factors.
Nice. And what happens when someone doesn't do it? Like, how do you deal with that? Because I imagine, I hear the phrase that came to mind was trust but verify, right?
Exactly.
But
Yeah.
what happens when someone like you trust them? Do you have some prep that you do ahead of time? Like, tell me about how you actually get people ready to take that trust on.
Yeah. 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 We definitely walk them through the process. We make sure there's an understanding on both sides. And then ultimately, we do have to check work. So it could be myself, it could be a partner, it could be another associate OD that's checking, but we're making sure that everything's done correctly. Once again, our kind of biweekly meetings, that's a good time to kind of just check in on everyone, make sure everything is done correctly. But ultimately, yeah, it's important. You can't just let them run free. Trust but verify. You know what gets measured is managed, right? So that's another kind of a little platitude that we use. But ultimately, it's important to just keep checks and balances.
So what I'm hearing is, and correct me if I'm wrong, this is kind of your process. You take a this is a task. What are
Mhm.
the critical elements that have to get done and turn it into like a checklist with maybe some guidance around it, maybe not, depending on how specific you need to be. Then you sit down, you highlight people who might be capable of doing it and assessing them and then saying, look, this is what we're going to do. Do you understand? And does that make sense to you? Do you have questions? And so before you even start on day one, you kind of make sure you're both on the same page with expectations and how to do the work. And then you
Absolutely.
actually do it and then you monitor it ongoing, making sure it's done properly, like maybe through audits or double checking some of the work occasionally.
Yeah, yeah, and that's absolutely. I think you brought up a critical point there. Is ultimately you have to monitor this as you go through it. You can't just let it run. It's so important. And then from monitoring, we can get better. So sometimes I might put out an operation, realize that we can improve it. Sometimes a staff member realizes it, or I realize it during the process, and so we're able to make things better. And I'm a really big fan of lean theory, so I'm sure you've got a lot of clients that are as well. But yeah, PDCA, that's a method that we utilize a
Okay.
lot, and basically everything in the Lean Six Sigma.
Yeah, we could talk about that as another podcast. I
Oh
was a
yeah.
I was a I don't know if I told you, I was actually the head lean person for Dell Computers with 3 other facilities before they shipped
Oh,
me off to
fantastic. Were you a
Minnesota.
black belt then? Or
I was a black belt in Six Sigma and lean was yeah, I got certified with lean as well. I had
awesome.
a lean Six Sigma company. So I
Yeah.
had a consulting clients. Anyways, that's a side note.
Yeah.
We could really geek out on that if you wanted to, but, so tell me a little bit about some of the struggles that you hit. Like, where'd you hit the roadblocks when you were growing to multiple locations and growing your other ventures?
Yeah. I think number one was finding the right people.
Mm,
And, there's a little bit of luck that's involved with that. Also, we've got an amazing staff flow right now. And our staff members, we would not trade them for the world. But it took us years to get to that point. And especially after 2020, COVID, right after that, we had the whole where you just couldn't find quality employees. They didn't want to stick around. We had to go through all of that. And ultimately, it just came down to number one is you got to find people that vibe well together and just fit your culture. You can't just hire folks just because a resume looks good. That goes for both ODs and for staff. It what's on paper doesn't really matter. It matters when they get into your office. And so through those learning processes, we found that the interview process was something that we really needed to fix. And so that was something that I worked on quite a bit. My interviews, I can think back to 5, 10 years ago, the interviews were just, standard 10, 20-minute interviews.
mhm.
And it really didn't learn enough about the individual. And now it's more of a working interview where we put them in different environments. We really get to know them as a person. I don't really care about these rubric questions anymore because ultimately everyone's going to figure that out unless they just can't figure out anything at all. So it really comes down to that cultural fit and just can they work well with each other? Because we're in a service related business here.
I think those are really good insights. So, um, so what made you wanna grow, right? Why'd you wanna go from just 1 practice to 2 and then ODs on finance and all these other ventures that you do?
Yeah, growth to me is exciting. Can sit in the exam room for a few days in a row, seeing patients, and then ultimately, I love optometry, but I kind of get bored with the routineness of it. So, growth is exciting because it presents new challenges. At this point, at the end of the year, we're actually acquiring a third practice here, and
Nice.
the partner that I brought on this year is very growth oriented as well, and he's a bit younger than me, so he's got that ambition too. So, yeah, it's just fun to see how things change, and ultimately, at the end of the day whether it be ODs on finance or the practices, I want to see optometry thrive. My passion is for the profession and making sure this profession continues to go the way it does. I don't want to see it become another pharmacy where we're just taken over by conglomerates. And I think only way we can do that is if independent practitioners continue to grow. And whether that be scaling to multiple locations or just scaling one office you have and growing that internally, we have to keep growing. We can't be happy with just what we have, because ultimately we're going to have those corporate entities come in and swoop in and take over.
Yeah, I think you're spot on. Now, I do think we have the element of service a little bit more than
Yeah.
pharmacy. Pharmacy is very transactional, so hopefully that'll help the industry a little bit. Um,
Yeah. Okay.
so let's you mentioned it a little bit around staffing. I know a lot of folks are having challenges with staffing and turnover, specifically doctor and non-doctor. But let's put the doctor side for a second. What are you doing around your non-doctor staff? How are you keeping them? How are you finding them? Like, how do you support them? Right? What are you doing with that challenge? Anything you can share to help the audience out?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the number one thing is to realize why attrition happens. And, if we look back to kind of the old school thought around attrition, it's like, because they're not getting paid enough, right? Or it's because they're not getting enough benefits, et cetera. But what we're finding in nowadays, and I'm sure you've seen this as well, is staff really the number one thing, especially because we have a lot of kind of millennials and Gen Zs are basically our staff now. I went from funny, my original office in Los Altos, we went to from having an average age of 60 in our staff to an average age of 24. So,
Wow.
so we had a complete generational shift. And the folks that were in their 60s, what they wanted was completely different than what the folks in their mid, late 20s want. And ultimately, it comes down to a good work environment. And a lot of them, they want to work 4 days a week. I mean, that's just the big thing with the younger generation is the work-life balance. So just finding those things, and it's unique to each one of them. We've got one staff member, she's got a little one at home. And so we give her flexibility. She's a great salesperson. So we give her flexibility. And that's been the big thing that's kept her with us is she's like, hey, no other office will, let me leave early on a Wednesday because I need to take care of my little one. So it's things like that and I think that's the second thing is empathy. It's just understanding each of these individuals and what their needs are. And at the end of the day, you got to have a competitive compensation structure. So
Yeah.
salary benefits, et cetera. But ultimately, I think the number one thing is just seeing what they want and being able to deliver that.
Yeah, and I think like you said, those are kind of table stakes, right? Everyone's going to be competitive in this space. So whether you're above or yeah, but I think you hit on the head. That's what we're seeing too, is creating that. We even toyed around the idea of just doing like, hey, why don't we just switch to 4 days a week and then just stagger which day is off by office. So it's either Tuesday through Friday at one office and Monday through Thursday at another. And you have coverage 5 days a week, but you get a 4-day work week from those staff. So, and if people want to work more, they can. So
Yeah, absolutely.
yeah, that's interesting you bring that up. So, and I'm seeing that as well.
Yeah, another thing we noted is we're in the Bay Area, California, and most offices are open on Saturday or Sunday or both days. We're just a Monday through Friday practice, and we actually do a half day on Fridays at one of our locations. So we've seen that that's a huge benefit. Most of our staff have come pre-trained, which is awesome. They've come from other offices because they like the schedule. And, people have talked to me about this or other ODs are like, oh, you're not open on Saturday. That's when you get the most patients in. And the funny thing is sure, you might get the most volume in, but I asked most of those ODs, is that when you're getting the most revenue? And they're like, no, it's not. And that's just how it works is ultimately you can be open less days and you can do better. And I think a lot of ODs kind of miss that and they try to be open 6 or 7 days a week when in reality you could be open 4 days. Really have to look at your metrics and look at your daily production. And sometimes that can actually make more sense and increase your net revenue. So
Yeah.
just something to add in there.
Yeah. I think another guest, I think a couple of guests actually kind of hinted to that it's about the market you're serving, right?
Mhm.
If
Exactly.
sometimes when you open up these segments, you open up to other segments of the market that aren't necessarily your ideal patient base.
Yeah.
So they value convenience and price over quality and relationships. And at least I know a lot of private practices find that they focus on quality and relationships over being a low cost leader. So
Mhm.
yeah,
Yeah.
it's interesting. What challenges are kind of keeping you up at night right now? Like what is like, man, what keeps Aaron up?
Oh man, quite a few. I would say from the practice standpoint, it's just keeping the practice busy and ultimately we want to continue growing and we've got a lot of moving parts right now. We've got full-time associate ODs just keeping their schedules full. and just keeping staff productive. Because obviously, when you've got multiple locations, you're not at each location all the time. And so, how do we deal with that? How do we keep people motivated? How do we make sure that the transition between doctor and staff works? How do we make sure the staff is selling to a level that's sustainable for both their salaries and for us to have a healthy net? So yeah, all of that keeps me up at night in terms of the practice. So there's like quite a few things, and I don't think there's any solution to that. That's just part of the dynamics of running a business. So
Yeah, this might be a part of, yeah, you're like you said, just running one of these businesses. So help me understand a little bit about how did you come to this journey? Like, it's not intuitive to find these things out, right? They don't necessarily teach business in OD school, not that much, maybe a class or two.
yeah.
It looks like, I mean, you've come a long way. Like, what's your personal journey like? What triggered this? Like, was there anything you did? Any kind of insights you had from a personal development standpoint?
Yeah. When I went through OD school, when I got out, I remember I was just so confused about life in general. I knew that, okay, I know how to practice optometry, and so do all my classmates. I remember I returned to the Bay Area I went to school in Memphis, Tennessee, took a job at a corporate office and just didn't really know what I was going to do. I always wanted to be a practice owner, but it just seemed so daunting at that time. It was really hard to even find a job. I was working like 2 or 3 days a week. And at that point, I met Dat Bowie, who is co-founder of Odys on Finance. And yeah, one night over beers, we were just talking about it. And we're like, hey, first of all, this situation isn't the greatest. Second of all, we were talking to all our OD colleagues and no one understood anything about finances. And we talk about this in the book, and it's also on the Odys on Finance website. We actually both worked at the same corporate office and met an 80-year-old optometrist that was still working.
Mm.
The reason he was working was because he had to save up for retirement. So, which was a very sad case. The guy could barely walk. Just obviously shouldn't have been working, but just got stuck in that situation where he did have to work. And so that kind of lit a fire under us where we're like, hey, let's learn a little bit more about finances. And then eventually we started the Odys on Finance Facebook group. And of course that grew into its whole company. And of course, 30,000 members later, it's become something that we realize, hey, most ODs have a similar interest in this, whether it be from personal or practice side. And around the time that we first started, that's when I bought my first practice and really just became more and more interested in how do we make this thing run better? Because when I purchased it, it wasn't the previous owner was a great guy, but just didn't know how to run the business out. So I had to figure that out on the fly. I was kind of just, being thrown in the fire. So that's where a lot of the passion stemmed from was, hey, how do we figure this out? How do we figure this out fast? Because I need to know what to do here. So that's where it came from.
That's pretty exciting. So it's almost like you jumped and built a parachute on the way down a little bit.
Yeah.
That's what I tell people my philosophy is too. It doesn't always work though. Sometimes I hit the ground pretty hard, but it's okay.
Yeah.
It's fun.
Those failures, you learn from those too. So
There you go. So let's brainstorm a little bit. I kind of want to get in your thought process. If you had to double or triple the size of your business, go to 6, 8 stores within a couple of years, how would you approach that? What would you look at? What is the first thing you would look at? Like how do you think about growing your business? I know you're talking
yeah.
about a third one now, but let's go think big.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned that because I was just meeting with, once again, I just brought in a partner actually last week. So he just bought into 50%. And we were talking about this exact thing. We do have a goal, and ultimately the goal is to max out the amount of locations we got. In California, you can have 11 total before the state board says no more. So you have a limit on that. So our goal is to hit the 11 in the next 5 years. And what we look at is we look at acquisition. And the reason for acquisition is in the Bay Area and just the general surrounding area, it is extremely dense here. And there is a practice on every street. So cold sorting practice just doesn't make sense for us. We're looking at acquisitions specifically of mid-sized practices is what we call them. So we were actually talking about this yesterday. So around the 700 to 1 million range. And we're looking for practices that have a retiring doctor because that has an established patient base. And also that probably has a lot of room for improvement. And what we've found is most retiring doctors, their RPP can be stretched by at least $100 to $200 per patient.
And our RPP is revenue per patient, right?
Revenue per patient, yeah. And the reason for that is they're not enacting a lot of new technology. Normally their contact lens fits are just a very low fee, ultra wide field, not utilizing that on every patient. And just a revamping of the optical. Most of them here in California don't do medical. So all these things that we can add on to make those bigger. And the number two thing, and this is a personal philosophy for me, is to always own real estate. So we own buildings that all our practices reside in. And actually, we're moving one of our practices to an owned building in the next couple months. And for me, that's vital. Number one in California, leases every time you renew one skyrocket just because we're dense here. And the other thing too is just having that equity, because in the long run, that's going to be beneficial. If you need that cash for something, you can utilize that. You could, if you had to use the cash out refinance, you could do that. The other thing too is you just have complete control over that aspect, and you don't have to worry. Hey, $6,000 to $10,000 a month is going out as rent because it's just going out to rent to another company, which is your LLC holding that building. So that's our second thing, is just looking for the right practices to acquire, and then making sure to put them in real estate that we own.
Interesting. I like that strategy.
Yeah.
It's good. So let's shift gears a little bit. So we want to understand what makes you tick. So tell us, maybe share with us a couple of formative moments in your life. So it could have been, hey, I started a lemonade stand when I was 6 years old, or it could have been, had an amazing class in high school or teacher, or it could have been last week, right? I don't know, but things that really emotionally stand out to you is like, oh, this really, I think this experience made me who I am today. Can you share like an experience or two like that?
Yeah, I think one experience was when I graduated from high school. I ended up going to UCLA for undergrad, and I remember in high school I got straight A's, and it was easy to get A's. I went to UCLA my freshman year. I remember just getting absolutely destroyed in my first quarter, and it took me a couple quarters before I kind of recovered from that. Classes were a lot tougher, and they weren't tougher because in high school I was just taught you memorize everything, right? At UCLA, they don't care about that. They care about teaching you how to think. And that was the number one thing I gained from my undergrad, is all the information I learned. I was a evolutionary biology major. Like, I don't use any of it, but I do utilize how to think. And that's super important. And I think a lot of folks don't utilize that enough as business owners. You have to learn how to think about your business. It's not about, looking at this metric, comparing it to your friend, and then trying to improve it. It's not necessarily just growing your gross revenue. That's a vanity metric. We all know that. But for some reason, it's still utilized as kind of a bragging point, which makes no sense to me. Ultimately, it's understanding the admin flow of your business, whether it be how your staff is utilized or how your cost of goods are, et cetera, just looking at different things and kind of applying those to the business. And just stepping back once again, it's just how to think. It's not necessarily memorizing things that are useful for the business, but how can I look at this and constantly critique this business so that it can get better? Not necessarily to drag it down, but how can I make it better? So that's kind of my thought process. And really, it was that first year in college that taught me, hey, this is the way that you should be thinking, is kind of looking at things from a different perspective.
Interesting. Yeah, that's it's interesting because this over the past year we've been working on that too. How do people learn?
Yeah.
And I think it's how do you understand what I've been understanding, and you tell me if this is what you found. How do you develop relationships between different things, and how does that how do you understand how things interact with each other and why they're important, and determining that really helps get insight. So like
Yeah.
you said, it's not just okay to have revenue per patient. Why is a certain number important to you? Why does this person have $1,000 revenue per patient versus this one have 250?
Yeah.
And they both have very profitable practices, right?
Exactly.
And why? What's the difference? And which one's more relevant for you? And those are absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah. What we find in optometry is that there's just no one size fits all. Every practice is unique. That's the one thing when we see these kind of these consulting pieces come out where it's like, do this one thing in your practice. It's like, yeah, and that's great, but every practice is its unique entity. I mean, they're all living, breathing things. So you have to look at unique structures in your practice and what really is going to work for that. So I agree with you there.
Interesting. So tell me, let's time travel a little bit. Take me back to 4 days after you graduated from OD school. What would you tell your younger self, knowing what you know now?
Oh, yes. I think quite a few things, but I think the number one thing is, hey, it's going to be okay. And you're going to get this figured out, because everyone does. And, I get the opportunity to speak to a lot of ODs that are just out of school or that are graduating. We do it both through the Cold Start Accelerator and the Practice Purchase Accelerator on ODs on Finance. And of course, Dad does it with student loans. And really, it's just, hey, everything's going to be okay. The landscape is shifting, and it's going to continue to shift for our profession. And you just got to roll with the punches, because ultimately you're going to still have a job. It's just going to look different. 5, 10 years down the line, once AI completely, takes a hold of optometry, you're still going to have your job. It's just going to look different. So ultimately, there's nothing to fear. But also, if you're looking to buy a practice or be a practice owner, get involved with everything you possibly can. Learn as much as you can as early as possible. And don't be afraid to make mistakes, because mistakes are going to be made. That's part of life. You're not supposed to do everything perfectly.
Yeah, I think that's really good advice for yourself as well as maybe some other folks listening.
Yeah.
So tell me a little bit about what you like to do for fun. Like, tell us a little bit about how you hobbies. You sound like a busy guy, so I don't know. I'm not sure how much time you get for that, but when you do get time, what do you do?
Yeah, absolutely. I think exercise is vitally important to me. So every morning I dedicate an hour to both lift and run outside. So that's really important. So that's a 5:30 every day thing for me. Other than that, enjoy music, live music, and also sports as well. So we're big fans of local sports. So like watching Warrior games, and of course, always support UCLA teams, even though they don't do so well these years.
Are you a Niners fan or Raiders
Yeah,
fan?
yeah, and a Niners fan, and also my family's from Minnesota, so I'm a Vikings fan. But
Okay,
yeah,
that's
association.
that's convenient this year. So
Yeah,
you
a little bit better than this year.
what a good team. Yeah, a couple good teams. So well, cool. Where can people connect with you if they want?
Yeah, absolutely. They can connect with me on Odie's on Finance, and you can always jump. If you're an Odie, you can jump on the Facebook group or jump on the website, or you can email me, aaron@odiesonfinance.com, and be happy to talk with you.
Great, and we'll put all that in the contact information as well. And so, thanks again, Dr. Aaron Neufeld, for being on the show.
Thanks for having me on, Keith.
Yeah, it was great. And thank you, audience, for listening. And if you laughed or found anything interesting, please share the podcast or video with anyone that you know. And thank you again, Dr. Neufeld. And this has been another great episode of Optometrist Building Empires. And we'll see you next time. That's a wrap on another episode of Optometrist Building Empires. Thanks for joining. For show notes and more, visit buildingempires.live. This show is proudly sponsored by My Business Care Team. My Business Care Team was born out of staffing challenges my wife and I faced together, managing multiple optometry locations. We refined our approach at Classic Vision Care and now offer our expertise to others. If you're experiencing challenges with staffing and you'd like to set up a discovery call, we'd be happy to help you and connect you with the right resources. We'll see you next time.